just 2.4%. That's the fraction of speaking characters in our biggest films who are shown with any disability at all. For decades, millions of people never saw themselves on screen, their stories silenced, their realities rewritten by those who could hear. But one night in March 1986, a young deaf actress stepped onto the Oscar stage and shattered a century of Hollywood silence. Why did it take so long? And what happened when the cameras finally started to listen? That actress was Marlee Matlin. Her win for Children of a Lesser God was a seismic event, but it didn't spark a revolution. Instead, for nearly 4 decades, Hollywood kept telling the same two stories about deafness, the inspirational victim or the magical lip reader. Meanwhile, a parallel world was forming, a powerful, organized crime underworld depicted in hundreds of films, with one glaring omission. What happens when these two invisible worlds collide? The answer lies in a single, unprecedented project that would force Hollywood to confront its own silence. In 2021, producer Anya Petrova was sifting through a mountain of rejected scripts when a single line in a coverage report caught her eye. Unmarketable, the female lead's deafness adds nothing to the plot. The script was a gritty mafia romance, a genre that reliably churned out millions. The note perfectly crystallized the problem. Deafness was still seen as a narrative burden, not a human detail. Petrova, the daughter of a hard-of-hearing mother, saw a terrifying gap in the market. What if the silence wasn't a weakness, but the ultimate advantage? To understand the scale of her ambition, you have to rewind. After Matlin's Oscar, the industry patted itself on the back and moved on. Deaf actors found work, but in a ghetto of very specific roles. The inspirational teacher, the tragic accident victim, the wise, silent sage. The message was clear. Your deafness is your entire character. Your story must be about overcoming it. Meanwhile, the American mob genre, from The Godfather to The Sopranos, ruled the cultural landscape. It was a world built on power, loyalty, and brutal communication. A world where missing a whisper could get you killed. And in over 50 years of iconic mafia stories, not a single significant character used a hearing aid. The numbers tell the story of two segregated industries. On one side, a multi-billion-dollar crime drama machine. On the other, what researchers call disability drag. A 2024 study by USC's Annenberg Initiative found that of the 105 disabled characters across the top films, only a handful were deaf. And crucially, over 60% of those roles went to hearing actors cripping up. The National Association of the Deaf had been issuing position papers for decades, pleading for authentic casting. Their arguments were ignored with a brutal, market-driven logic. Why risk a $1 million production on an actor who might not hear a director's cue? But Petrova wasn't looking at spreadsheets. She was looking at history. She found a precedent not in Hollywood but in the old country. Her research uncovered obscure folk tales from early 20th century Naples, stories of a clandestine network of deaf messengers used by the Camorra. They weren't fighters, they were perfect conduits. Unable to overhear secrets not meant for them, their loyalty was never questioned. Their limitation was their supreme asset. This was the kernel. A story where the disability wasn't a problem to be solved, but the central, ingenious plot mechanism. She took the idea to her contacts. The rejections were unanimous and swift. One studio head told her point blank, "Anya, no one wants to see a vulnerable woman in a crime story. The fantasy is protection, not realism." Another asked if the lead could just read lips perfectly, solving the inconvenience. The project was dead before it could breathe. But then, a coincidence that feels like fate. In the spring of 2022, two events collided. Coda, a small film starring a predominantly deaf cast, won the Oscar for Best Picture. It proved deaf stories could be profitable, heartfelt blockbusters. And in the UK, a deaf actress named Rose Ayling-Ellis won the nation's heart on Strictly Come Dancing, her grace shattering perceptions. Suddenly, the calculus changed. Petrova's phone rang. It was a streaming service, hungry for the next Coda but wanting something grittier, something for the prestige drama crowd. They gave her a development budget and one non-negotiable mandate: Find a deaf lead with the presence to command a screen opposite seasoned tough guys. The hunt began, and it immediately hit a wall, not because of a lack of talent, but because of a systemic failure. There were brilliant deaf actors, but few with the specific, simmering intensity needed for noir. Many had been steered exclusively toward gentle, dramatic roles. Then, a casting director stumbled upon a stage recording from the National Theatre of the Deaf. A young actress named Alara Vance was performing Lady Macbeth in full American Sign Language. Her performance wasn't gentle. It was ferocious, strategic, and chillingly quiet. Petrova flew to see her. Vance, 28, had grown up mainstreamed in hearing schools, an expert lip reader who wore a hearing aid she often hid. She had the gentle face the script described, but her eyes held a formidable, observing intelligence. Petrova offered her the part on the spot. Vance's response was not what she expected. She said no. Vance's refusal was a quiet earthquake. She told Petrova she was tired of being a first, tired of being the diversity hire in a system that wouldn't accommodate her. She'd been burned before by directors who grew impatient with ASL interpreters on set, by sound departments that treated her hearing aids feedback as her problem. "I won't be your lesson for the day," she said. "I want to be the best actor in the room. Can your production promise that?" Petrova had no ready answer. She had the money, the green light, the star, but she didn't have the infrastructure. The entire apparatus of a film set, from the assistant director's shouted orders to the subtle audio cues, was built for hearing. This was the real cliff. The industry knew how to cast a deaf actor. It had no idea how to work with one. Petrova had 6 weeks before the start of principal photography to reinvent the wheel. She hired a deaf production designer, a deaf cultural consultant, and mandated ASL classes for the entire heads of department. She replaced walkie-talkies with text-based systems, designed visual cue lights, and revamped the shooting schedule to allow for interpretation. The budget ballooned. Rumors started leaking to the trades, troubled production. Petrova's folly. The pressure mounted from the studio to just cast a hearing actress and use post-production effects for the hearing aid. It would be cheaper. It would be easier. The night before the final casting decision was due, Petrova sat in her office with the 2 scripts in front of her. One was the original, with Alara Vance's name on the cover. The other was a hastily rewritten version, the deafness reduced to a visual footnote for a hearing star. She faced a multi-million-dollar gamble. Bet on an untested system and an actress who demanded excellence, or take the safe, hollow path that had been trodden for a century. She made her choice. The next morning she called Alara Vance. The actress listened in silence. Then she asked one final question. "When do we start?" The first day on set was a silent earthquake. The call for quiet on set meant nothing. The sound of a film slate clapping was replaced by a soft strobe light. Alara Vance stood at the center of a meticulously constructed cathedral set, surrounded by 60 hearing crew members who had no idea how to do their jobs. The director, Marco Cellini, a veteran of crime thrillers, gave his first instruction through an interpreter. Vance listened, then asked a question in sign. The interpreter translated. "She wants to know the motivation for the tear. Is it humiliation or is it rage?" Cellini was stunned. In 15 years, no actor had ever asked that before the first take. He was used to giving line readings, not discussing subtext. This was not going to be easier. It was going to be harder and better. They called it the protocol, a 50-page document that re-engineered the basic mechanics of a film set. Every department head had a designated visual liaison. Script changes were communicated via encrypted tablets, not shouted across the soundstage. The most radical shift was in performance. Cellini could not use his usual toolbox of verbal cues. Faster, softer, give me more. He had to articulate intent with crystal clarity before the camera rolled. The first week's dailies were a disaster. The scenes between Vance and the male lead, played by hearing actor Gabriel Rossi, were stiff, disconnected. Rossi was trying to act at asterisk her, not with asterisk her. The chemistry was dead. The studio's nervous notes started flooding Petrova's inbox. "Where's the heat? they asked. "This is a romance. We need sparks." The crisis point came in week 2, filming the crucial confrontation where Vance's character, Sophia, discovers the betrayal. The scene required her to overhear a whispered plot against her from across a crowded restaurant. The script said she hears a fragment, but Vance couldn't hear a fragment. She proposed an alternative. What if she sees it? She developed a complex piece of business where she reads the conspirator's lips in a mirrored surface, her face a mask of dawning horror. Cellini was skeptical but desperate. They shot it. When they reviewed the take, the entire crew fell silent. It was chilling. More tense, more visually compelling than any overheard whisper could have been. In that moment, the disability didn't hinder the plot. It invented a new, more cinematic language for suspense. Rossi, watching the monitor, turned to Cellini and said, "I've been doing this wrong. She's not missing cues. She's creating a new rhythm. We have to learn it." This became the invisible war on set, not between people but between methodologies. The hearing crew, conditioned by speed and noise, chafed at the deliberate visual pace. The deaf crew, empowered by the protocol, insisted on precision. Tensions simmered. A veteran gaffer was fired for repeatedly ignoring visual safety signals. A sound mixer quit, complaining the production was handcuffed. But a funny thing began to happen. The forced silence started producing unexpected artistic dividends. Scenes became more focused, actors more present. The usual barrage of directorial notes during a take vanished, allowing performances to build uninterrupted. Cellini began calling it pure cinema. But the studio was not watching dailies for pure cinema. They were watching the calendar and the burning budget. The pressure exploded from an unexpected direction: the test screening. In a desperate bid to prove the film's viability, the studio insisted on a preview for a small, recruited audience. The screening was a catastrophe, not because of the film's quality but because of a technical failure. The closed captioning system glitched, rendering half the signed dialogues as gibberish. The hearing audience, confused and frustrated, gave the film the lowest scores in the studio's history. The report that landed on the studio head's desk was brutal. Concept is confusing. Lead character's inability to hear key plot points feels like a contrived obstacle. Recommend recutting to minimize sign language and ADR over key scenes with a voiceover. Petrova was summoned to a closed-door meeting. The mandate was simple: reshoot. Reshoot the central scenes, minimizing Vance's signing, and add a narrative voiceover to guide the audience. It was the original fear realized: the reduction of a deaf character to a passive object explained by a hearing voice. Petrova refused. The studio head presented her with the numbers. The budget had overrun by $8 million. The test scores were poison. The film, as it stood, was unreleasable. He gave her 48 hours to comply, or the film would be shelved indefinitely, a tax write-off. All the risk, all the innovation would vanish into a corporate vault. That night, Ilara Vance requested a meeting with Petrova and Cellini. She arrived with her interpreter and a single notepad. She didn't plead, she presented a case. The problem wasn't the film, she argued. The problem was the frame. They had tested a deaf-led film on a hearing audience with broken tools. What if they flipped the test? What if they screened it with proper accessibility for a mixed audience of deaf and hearing viewers? She knew the deaf community would mobilize for it. It was a huge, career-ending gamble. If it failed, the studio would bury the film and blacklist everyone involved. Petrova looked at Cellini. The director, who had transformed from skeptic to evangelist, simply nodded. They had one card left to play. They would host their own screening and invite the most powerful critic in Hollywood. Not a journalist, but the one person whose opinion could override a studio head: the legendary and famously reclusive Marlee Matlin. Getting to Marlee Matlin required navigating a fortress of silence. Her manager's first response was a flat refusal. Matlin, he said, was tired of being the token deaf opinion for Hollywood's guilty conscience. Petrova didn't send a script. She sent the 50-page protocol and a clip of the restaurant scene, the one where Sophia reads the plot in the mirror. 24 hours later, Matlin's assistant called. She would attend, but under 3 conditions. The screening must be fully accessible with both ASL interpreters and real-time captioning. Half the audience must be deaf or hard of hearing, and there would be no press, no studio executives, and absolutely no small talk afterward. It was less an invitation and more a sovereign audit. The night of the screening was held in a small independent theater in Silver Lake. The air was thick with a tension none of the crew had ever felt. This wasn't a preview, it was a trial. The house lights dimmed. For the next 112 minutes, Petrova watched the back of Matlin's head, searching for any reaction. The audience, a mix of deaf and hearing film students and advocates, reacted with a startling intensity. Laughter came in different places. Gasps were silent but visible. When the final scene faded to black, there was a beat of absolute stillness. Then the deaf members of the audience raised their hands and began to wave them, the deaf community's equivalent of applause, a silent, shimmering storm of approval. The hearing audience, taking their cue, joined in with conventional clapping, but Matlin sat motionless. Then she stood, turned to face Petrova and signed 2 words to her interpreter. "We talk." In a back office, Matlin was direct. "You made a good film, not a good * deaf film, a good film, period." But then she delivered the blow. "It will fail." She explained that the system wasn't rigged by malice but by inertia. Marketing wouldn't know how to sell it. Theaters wouldn't provide the accessibility. The algorithm would bury it. "You changed the product," she said, "but you didn't change the pipeline." Then she offered a lifeline that was also a dare. She would use her influence to get the film into one major festival, not a disability festival but a mainstream powerhouse, the Toronto International Film Festival. But there was a catch. The film had to compete in the general gala category against the year's biggest studio offerings. If it received a standing ovation, it would create a media event the studio couldn't ignore. If it landed with a thud, it would be a very public funeral. The gamble was insane. Festival audiences were notoriously tough, and the gala category was a gladiator arena for Oscar hopefuls. But they had no other move. The studio, hearing of the Matlin endorsement and the festival slot, reluctantly agreed to pause the reshoot order until after Toronto. It was a stay of execution, not a pardon. The next 6 weeks were a fever dream of re-editing, color correction, and sound mixing, all under the looming festival deadline. Then, 3 days before they were to ship the final print, disaster struck from a direction no one expected. The film's entire third act, including the climax, was leaked online. The leak was catastrophic and deliberate. The files were watermarked with internal codes, tracing back to a disgruntled sound editor who had been let go during production. The grainy, captioned version spread across piracy sites and niche film forums. The studio's legal team sprang into action with takedown notices, but the damage was done. The narrative in the press shifted overnight from groundbreaking deaf-led film to troubled production leaks. Worse, the deaf community itself was divided. Some hailed the leak as a victory for access, allowing deaf viewers to see the film without waiting for theatrical accommodations. Others were furious, arguing it undermined the very theatrical release that could prove the model. The leak didn't just threaten the film's financial future, it shattered the fragile consensus that had been building. Petrova received a midnight call from the festival director. The leak violated their premiere policy. Toronto was considering pulling the film from the gala lineup. Without the festival, the studio would kill the project for certain. In a last-ditch move, Petrova and Vance decided to weaponize the controversy. They called a press conference, not in a studio lot but at the headquarters of the National Association of the Deaf. Vance, without an interpreter, faced the cameras and spoke aloud, her voice soft but clear. "They say our film is in trouble because it was stolen and shared. But for decades our stories have been stolen and replaced. This leak is wrong, but the greater theft is happening in plain sight. We are not asking for charity. We are demanding competition." She then announced that instead of withdrawing, they would screen at Toronto as planned, but with a radical addition. Every single showing would be fully accessible, with open captioning and ASL interpretation, not as a special screening, but as the default. They would force the festival to adopt. In 1 week, the accessibility standards Hollywood had refused to build in a century. The festival, caught in a media firestorm and public pressure, agreed, but the logistical challenge was monstrous. They had to retrofit 6 theaters, train staff, and coordinate interpreters for multiple showings, all in days. The cost was astronomical. Petrova and Cellini mortgaged their homes to cover the upfront expenses. The studio, seeing the escalating PR disaster, refused to contribute a dollar. As the team boarded the flight to Toronto, they weren't carrying a film print. They were carrying the entire weight of a revolution that could now very publicly collapse under its own ambition. The festival had agreed to the accommodations, but the real test was still to come. Would anyone come to see a leaked film? And if they did, would they see a masterpiece or a museum piece? The answer would come from the most unpredictable critic of all, a room of 2,000 strangers holding their applause in their hands. The night of the gala premiere, the theater did not fall silent. It was silent to begin with. The usual pre-film chatter was replaced by the soft rustle of programs and the focused attention of an audience reading open captions on the screen. Petrova, Vance, and Cellini stood at the back, watching as 2,000 people, half of them deaf, half hearing, experienced the film exactly as intended. For the first 112 minutes, there was no way to gauge success. No collective laughs, no synchronized gasps, just intense individual engagement. Then the final shot faded, a beat, then another. The fear was paralyzing. Had it simply not worked? Then a man in the third row stood up. He was deaf and he began to sign, his movements broad and clear even in the dark. Beautiful. Then the person next to him stood, and then another. Waves of people rose, not just applauding but signing, gesturing, turning to face the filmmakers at the back of the theater. The hearing audience, understanding the moment, joined in with a roaring, sustained applause that shook the room. The ovation lasted 11 minutes. Film critics, hardened industry veterans, were seen wiping their eyes. The headline in Variety the next morning was not about the leak or the controversy. It read, "A revolution delivered in silence." The festival triumph was the turning point, but it was just the beginning of the war. The studio, facing a tidal wave of positive press and audience demand, reversed course completely. They not only greenlit the original cut for wide release, they doubled the marketing budget with one condition. Ilara Vance had to be the face of the campaign. She appeared on morning shows, not with an interpreter beside her, but with the hosts wearing discreet earpieces connected to a live transcriber. She gave interviews where she signed, and her spoken words were presented as the translation. The power dynamic flipped. The film, titled A Silent Trust, opened in 1,500 theaters nationwide, everyone equipped with the accessibility tools pioneered in Toronto. It wasn't a niche release. It was a mainstream event. The box office numbers told the final story. Opening weekend, $32 million, far exceeding projections. The demographic breakdown was the real shock. While the film performed strongly in major cities, its highest per-screen averages came from suburban multiplexes, places the studio had assumed would reject a subtitled film. The audience wasn't just the deaf community showing up in solidarity. It was hearing families, couples, crime thriller fans. The data proved the central thesis. A well-told story with a deaf lead wasn't a charity case. It was a market expansion. The film went on to gross over $200 million globally, a runaway profit against its bloated budget. But the true impact was measured in the contracts signed in the months that followed. 3 major studios announced deaf-led projects. A streaming service launched a development fund specifically for disabled creators, not as a diversity initiative, but as a new content vertical. The most significant shift was in casting. The practice of cripping up didn't end overnight, but it became a reputational risk. When a rival studio announced a biopic of a deaf musician with a hearing actor attached, the social media backlash was immediate and costly. The actor dropped out within 48 hours. The message was clear. The audience was now watching the watchers. Ilara Vance, once an actress who couldn't get auditions, became one of the most in-demand performers in Hollywood. She used her leverage not for bigger paychecks, but for structural change. Her contracts now included what the industry called the Vance Clause, a requirement for full on-set accessibility and a commitment to hire deaf crew in key departments. She turned down superhero franchises to produce a quiet drama about a deaf child, ensuring it was directed by a deaf filmmaker. Her career became the blueprint. The film's legacy, however, is cemented by a surprising detail very few people know. In the final cut, there's a scene where Sophia, the protagonist, adjusts her hearing aid. The soft feedback whine it emits was not a sound effect added in post-production. It was the actual real-time feedback from Alara Vance's own hearing aid, captured by a sensitive microphone during the take. The sound mixer had initially tried to remove it, standard practice to clean up audio. Director Marco Cellini stopped him. He said the whine was not a mistake. It was a layer of character, an intimate, authentic detail of her experience. That decision to leave in the flaw became a quiet manifesto. It declared that authenticity wasn't just about who was in front of the camera, but what truths were allowed to remain in the frame. The pipeline, as Marlee Matlin warned, is still slow to change. The 2024 Annenberg report showed the percentage of disabled characters in top films remained stagnant at 2.4%, the same number from a decade ago. But the nature of those roles has transformed. No longer just victims or inspirations, deaf characters are now detectives, scientists, lovers, and villains in major studio productions. The success of A Silent Trust didn't solve inclusion with one film. It proved the business case, making the next film and the next not just possible but inevitable. For Anya Petrova, the producer who bet everything, the victory was personal. At the film's premiere in her mother's hometown, she watched as her mother, who had hidden her hearing loss for 50 years, sat in the crowded theater wearing her hearing aids openly for the first time. The credits rolled, the house lights came up, and her mother turned to her, not needing to say a word. The look on her face was the final, silent review that mattered most. The gamble had been about more than box office or awards. It was about changing what stories get told and, in the process, changing who gets to feel seen. The silence, it turned out, was never empty. It was full of people waiting to be heard. So what does the success of A Silent Trust actually mean? It's not that one film changed everything. The percentage of disabled characters on screen remains stubbornly low. The system's inertia is massive, but the story of this film is about a crack in the dam. It proved that the audience for authentic, inclusive stories is not a niche. It's the majority, waiting for someone to get out of the way. It showed that accessibility, when baked into the creative process from the start, doesn't limit art. It expands it, creating new visual languages, new rhythms, new forms of suspense and connection that hearing-centric filmmaking had never considered. The lingering question isn't whether more films like this will be made. They will. The market forces now demand it. The real question is, what other silences are we still ignoring? Which other communities are trapped in the 2.4%, their stories flattened into inspirational tropes or outright erased? The blueprint is now public. The protocol exists. The battle is no longer about proving it can be done, but about the will to do it again and again for every overlooked perspective. The most profound shift might be invisible to audiences. It's in the day-to-day reality of film sets across Hollywood, where deaf crew members now have a documented career path, where hearing directors are learning to communicate with clarity rather than noise, and where the feedback whine of a hearing aid is no longer an error to be fixed, but a note in the symphony of human experience. Change, real change, happens not in the spotlight of a premiere, but in the quiet adjustments of craft. This story began with a statistic, 2.4%, a number that measured absence. It ends with a different metric, the reverberations of a single story that refused to be silent. The next time you watch a film, listen for what isn't there. The story's untold, the perspectives missing, the voices edited out. Then ask why. The answer will tell you more about the world we've built than any special effect ever could. If you want to see more documentaries about the hidden revolutions shaping our culture, hit subscribe. Because the most important stories are often the ones we haven't been told yet.